Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here. I was recently asked what effect the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to have on PPP markets in the medium term. Now, when thinking about PPP markets, I always like to start by looking at the overall level of infrastructure investment in the particular market. Then, of that overall level of infrastructure investment, we can look at what proportion of that investment is going to flow through to the PPP pipeline. In other words, what proportion of projects are likely to be PPPs. Once we've looked at that, we can then consider how the risk-return equation of those PPPs might be affected. So let's start by looking at the level of infrastructure investment. The COVID-19 pandemic actually has some positive impacts in terms of infrastructure investment. We've seen some governments, particularly here in Australia, already talking about increased infrastructure investment being part of the economic stimulus solution that will drive economic recovery as we come out of the pandemic situation. In addition, the pandemic is likely to place renewed focus on particular sectors for infrastructure investment. In particular, some governments will identify that they have underinvested in health and social service infrastructure, and that has created some challenges for them during the pandemic. So we are likely to see in some countries increased infrastructure investment in those sectors. In addition, the pandemic has shown that global supply chains are quite fragile, and we may well see some increased investment in more resilient supply chain infrastructure. The advisory firm Castalia has a good article about this particular issue on their website. I'll add a link to that article in the video description. It's not all positive though in terms of infrastructure investment. Because the COVID-19 pandemic has both reduced revenues for governments as a result of the negative impacts on the overall economy, and also increased costs for government as a result of the response to the pandemic, naturally we are seeing governments facing much tougher fiscal circumstances than they had expected. In some countries, these fiscal constraints will reduce the level of investment in infrastructure. In addition, as a result of the slowing down of economies, we are seeing decreased demand for certain types of infrastructure. For example, the pandemic has had very strong negative impacts upon tourism, and that is likely to lessen the future investment in the medium term in tourism infrastructure. In addition, the economic slowdown has significantly impacted upon many types of transport infrastructure, along with the government restrictions on movement. If you want to know more about the impact on transport infrastructure, there's a very good article by the EDHEC Risk Institute, which takes you through the different transport sectors in different geographical regions and the impact that the pandemic is projected to have upon demand for that transport infrastructure. And again, I'll link to that article in the video description. Moving on now to the impact on the PPP pipeline. Once again, we can see both some positives and some negatives. In terms of the positives, some governments, particularly those with fiscal constraints, may see PPPs as a preferred delivery mechanism because of the way in which those PPPs are treated from a fiscal perspective. Other governments may place a stronger focus on the efficiency, effectiveness and innovation that PPPs can deliver, and may take a view that in constrained fiscal circumstances, those benefits of PPPs are more important than ever. In addition, with fiscal constraints, governments will often look to asset recycling. In other words, they will look at existing government-owned infrastructure that can potentially be transferred to the private sector for a period of time under a PPP contract in return for an upfront payment from the private sector, and that upfront payment provides the government with funds that can be invested in other projects. We've already seen here in Australia the Transport Minister in the state of New South Wales specifically talk about asset recycling as being one source of funding for infrastructure projects that will be part of that state's plan to revitalise its economy coming out of the pandemic. So in some markets, we're likely to see an increase in PPP or PPP type activity as we come out of the pandemic situation. Thailand is another example. Thailand has talked about the fact that it sees PPPs as being part of the economic stimulus coming out of this situation. On the other hand, of course, there are some potential negatives for PPPs. In particular, because of the long procurement times for PPPs, some governments will see PPPs as a non-preferred option for providing immediate fiscal stimulus. A good example here is Alberta in Canada. The government of Alberta had a package of schools that it was expected would be put out to the market as a PPP. The government has now said no, they won't be a PPP. In order to bring a more immediate project to the market, they will use a traditional form of delivery for those schools. In addition, for some governments, the pandemic situation has highlighted the inflexibility of PPPs. Some governments have projects where, in order to respond to the pandemic, they would like to be using the infrastructure in different ways, changing the nature of the services being provided, and so on. And for those governments, the fact that PPPs are somewhat inflexible may have been highlighted as one of the downsides of PPPs compared to traditionally delivered infrastructure. In many countries, PPPs also rely heavily on international bidders, and the combined impact of the economic situation and the restrictions on travel may make it more difficult to attract international bidders into some markets, and that again may cause some governments to make less use of PPPs as we come out of the crisis. What about the impact upon the risk and return of those PPP projects that do come to the market? Well, for those private sector organisations that come through the crisis relatively unscathed, they may find themselves with fewer strong competitors in the market if some of their competitors haven't fared so well through the crisis and find that they can't bid for future PPP projects. So for the stronger organisations involved in the PPP market, it may be quite a positive. In addition, with the economic slowdown, there may be more opportunities for smart PPP bidders to control costs and increase their return when they're bidding for projects or reduce their risk. Counteracting the potential increase in returns is some potential increase in risks. Most obviously, there are the impacts that we're seeing the pandemic have on existing PPPs that may well continue for some time into the future or may reoccur again in the future. The reduced demand for transport infrastructure that I mentioned earlier is a good example there. In addition, in some markets, bidders for PPPs may find that they need to deal with more fragile consortium partners and also less robust supply chains. As a result of the pandemic, obviously, many businesses have suffered. You may find that the businesses that you might have looked at as consortium partners in the past are no longer so financially robust. Or you may find that supply chains for particular raw materials or other inputs to your project are not as robust, not as timely in their delivery or as reliable. In addition, government counterparties in some markets may be weaker. With worsening financial positions of governments, you may find that payment is perhaps not as well assured as you would like. So there might be some additional focus on the creditworthiness of government counterparts. Finally, in some markets, both government and the private sector are seeing that the force majeure provisions in their PPP contracts aren't necessarily appropriate to deal with a situation such as this. If you saw my previous video, then You will have seen how in the UK, the government has come out and said for PPP projects, this is not being treated as a force majeure event, but then they are, by agreement, modifying the application of their PPP contracts in a somewhat similar way to the way in which some countries would treat a force majeure event. So we're likely to see in some future PPPs different risk allocation positions being put forward in terms of force majeure risk, and it might take some time for that to play out and perhaps come to new settled market positions as to how force majeure risk should be dealt with. So that's our quick overview of the potential medium-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on PPP markets. Thanks for watching and stay safe, everyone.